Happy Sunday, everyone. Coming at you from our family cabin where our shed got demolished. If you follow me on Facebook, you saw those photos, or you can see them on my page. All the heavy snowfall completely collapsed this like century-old shed that's out on the property. So been a fun weekend seeing all the havoc from weather. I haven't been up here in a few months. Today's topic is the proclamation to the world on the family that was issued some 28 years ago. And I want to address this question of whether it should be considered a prophecy or not. And if so, what does that mean? What I find interesting, though, starting with this issue, is when the proclamation was announced, it was kind of met with a collective shrug, right? Like, yeah, of course, this is what we believe. Yeah, of course, this is reasonable. Big deal. Why do we have this? It wasn't a landmark revelatory announcement. It wasn't a shift in doctrine. It wasn't rejected by mainstream society. It was quite in line. I mean, even marriage being between a man and a woman, you had the leading Democrat candidates for years after the publication of the proclamation saying marriage is between a man and a woman. And it wasn't until many years later when, activists and leftists and others really started shifting the tide in favor of so-called gay marriage. And that is, we'll talk about this in a minute, but I think that has been a big distraction for a lot of Latter-day Saints on this topic of the proclamation. Their attention becomes narrowly focused on the question of marriage to the exclusion of other issues that we should be focusing on too. We'll get into that in just a moment. First, it's kind of interesting. Here's the portion that you're familiar with from the proclamation. All human beings, male and female, are created in the image of God. Each is a beloved spirit, son or daughter of heavenly parents, and as such, each has a divine nature and destiny. Gender is an essential characteristic of individual premortal, mortal, and eternal identity and purpose. So there are other sections of the proclamation that have since become even more, shall we say, prescient. But this one, I think, stands out in large part due to the gender wars and widespread confusion among so many in society that don't know what a man is or a woman is, and it's up to you to define what that is, and anyone who identifies as whatever they want to be is now that thing, and we have to all accept that as, incontrovertibly true. And there is a lot of animosity and activism and angst in our society all around this question, where here decades ago, leaders of the church were saying gender is an essential characteristic of individual premortal, mortal, and eternal identity purpose. When they said that, it's like, well, okay, yeah, right, male and female. Like, no one could have foreseen the world that we are in today. I shouldn't say no one, right, for obvious reasons, but few among us could have foreseen the crazy changes that are happening in our society right now around gender. Okay, so revelation or not, prophecy or not. Well, Dallin Oaks said sometime after the proclamation was announced, he said that the subjects for the proclamation were identified and discussed by members of the Quorum of the 12 for nearly a year. Language was proposed, reviewed, and revised. Prayerfully, we continually pleaded with the Lord for his inspiration on what we should say and how we should say it. So this seems to suggest at least a prayerful effort, if not an inspired one, taking time to let it marinate, to reflect on it, to tweak it and give thoughts to it. And so one might infer from that it was a kind of revelatory outcome. Of course, there have been many other revelations received as a result of questioning and studying and so forth. And then you had Elder Boyd Packer in 2010 in a general conference talk. He said that the proclamation was a revelation. What's interesting is that the written version of that same talk refers to the proclamation as a guide. So if you watch the video version, he says it's a revelation, but then he or others edited the written version of it, and now they say that it is a guide. But where I really want to focus, there's a couple areas that I really want to focus on. The first has nothing to do with the text of the proclamation itself, and everything to do with the text that preceded its announcement. So the proclamation was announced to the world in a General Relief Society meeting, back when we used to have those, in 1995, by then President Gordon Hinckley. And it's a short paragraph, but here's what he said right before he started reading the actual proclamation. So he reads the whole proclamation, but before that, he says this: with so much of sophistry, like deception, sophistry that is passed off as truth, with so much of deception concerning standards and values, with so much of allurement and enticement to take on the slow stain of the world, we have felt to warn and forewarn. In furtherance of this, we, the First Presidency and the Council of the 12 Apostles, now issue a proclamation to the church and the world as a declaration and reaffirmation of standards, doctrines, and practices relative to the family, which church leaders have stated throughout its history. So why issue the proclamation? Why do this at all? Well, that he and the leaders were worried about sophistry being passed off as truth, right? Speak your truth, not what is the truth, right? Sophistry being passed off as truth, deception concerning standards and values, and allurement and enticement to take on the slow stain of the world. For those three reasons, they felt to warn and forewarn. So here they were in 1995, years before all the crazy gender wars and trans everything, and we're losing our understanding of identity, and identity is whatever people claim it is rather than anything innate or eternal or God-given. And what's interesting is that this idea of the slow stain of the world had been on President Hinckley's mind for some time. Months before, he had taught in a regional conference that we members of the church, quote, have a tendency to take on the ways of the world. We don't adopt them immediately, but we slowly take them on, unfortunately. So if you go back to past musings, like a couple of weeks ago, I talked about polling, why a lot of people are leaving the church, and we went over a bunch of polling. Or if you go back to the abortion episode or other things like that, we've talked before about how so many, especially younger members of the church, are increasingly embracing what Hinckley called the slow stain of the world, the standards and values of Babylon and so forth. And so here's Hinckley saying, we don't often adopt these ways of the world immediately, but we slowly take them on, unfortunately. We, not just younger members of the church too. It's not like, older members are doing everything right. So I thought that was interesting. And then a few months after he announced the proclamation, Hinckley said, why do we have this proclamation on the family now? Because the family is under attack. All across the world, families are falling apart. The place to begin to improve society is in the home. Children do, for the most part, what they are taught. We're trying to make the world better by making the family stronger. This is related to something I often say when I'm out fundraising or talking to supporters. I say, I don't think we're going to save our country at the Capitol, and I don't think we're going to save our country at the courtroom. If we're going to save our country, I think it's at the dinner table. Bringing families together, rebuilding social fabric, creating closer community bonds. Everything else is just window dressing and Band-Aids on the problem. And so here's Hinckley saying the family's under attack, families are falling apart. Well, in 1999, Elder Oaks gave an address where he articulated some of the ways in which the family is under attack. So this is the second area that I want to focus on. I'm going to read what he talked about, and then we're going to get into this idea of what are the real problems and what should we be doing about them? Because it's one thing to be like, oh, we fought for, male-female marriage and we lost, so moving on. Maybe the proclamation isn't as relevant now because we lost the marriage battle despite the church trying, and so let's focus on other stuff. That completely misses the picture. Absolutely, fundamentally misses the picture. We're going to get into that in just a moment. Here's Elder Oaks to start. 1999, he says, As church leaders, we've observed many worldwide trends and conditions that threaten the traditional family and have a disturbing effect upon our church members. I list 6 of these, not necessarily in order of importance. Number 1, as a result of increases in divorce and separation, the traditional 2-parent family is decreasing as the setting within which most children are raised. Number 2, increasing numbers of women are working outside of the home and devoting less attention to their responsibilities as mothers. Number 3, as more and more people travel great distances and enjoy flexibility as to where they reside, extended families are scattered, and the nurturing and disciplinary roles of grandparents, aunts, and uncles are felt by a smaller proportion of children. Number 4, the network of mothers who keep an eye on one another's children in a tight-knit community is likewise weakening. Number 5, the competitive demands of a variety of community and school activities weaken family activities and togetherness. Number 6, current attempts to redefine the family by treaty or law include everyone who has keys to the same house, threatening to dilute the legal concept of family beyond the point where it merits special protection. Okay, so this takes us to the end of the proclamation, where there's kind of a call to action that relates to what Elder Oaks is talking about, or then Elder Oaks. It says in the proclamation, we call upon responsible citizens and officers of government everywhere to promote those measures designed to maintain and strengthen the family as the fundamental unit of society. Calling upon all people in government, lay citizens, everybody else, to promote measures that will strengthen the family as the fundamental unit of society. So, again, I think that most members of the church interpreted that, especially at the time, because shortly after this is when the church got into the legal battles in Hawaii, trying to stop same-sex marriage there. And then it was Prop 8 in California, which was the big hullabaloo. And then it was the, U.S. Supreme Court case, efforts in Utah and elsewhere, right? So many members of the church, I feel like, read that statement. We call upon everyone to promote measures designed to strengthen the family as the fundamental unit of society. They look at that and they think we got to fight for government only recognizing marriage as being between a man and a woman. So if you assume that these measures that the proclamation is talking about are government oriented, because it's asking officers of government also to promote measures, right? So if we assume that we're just talking about government measures, narrowing the focus just to the topic of marriage is problematic because there are many other programs and policies that attack and weaken the family. Consider Sweden as an example. They have sky-high taxes, huge social welfare spending, tons of entitlements, heavily restricted, if not fully criminalized, homeschooling, tons of institutional programs to care for kids from cradle all the way to grave. And so the state has become this intimate partner in the lives of families, a caretaker from cradle to grave. My wife served a mission in Sweden. One thing that she remarked to me years ago was that in her 18 months there on her mission, she encountered one family, only one, where the mother stayed home to focus on raising the children. In 18 months, one family. Now, of course, that's not a scientific anything. It's just all of her experience out there talking to families. But the fact that it was like that at all, I think, suggests that the efforts in Sweden by the Swedish state have been successful in pulling mothers away from the home, into collecting children into the care of the state, breaking apart the natural ties between parents and children. And so this hopefully illustrates the broader point that it's not just who's allowed to get married, who's allowed to jointly file taxes together, who's allowed to, inherit property and have hospital visitation rights. The marriage issue is important. Ultimately, government should not be involved in marriage at all. Leave it to the churches and others. This shouldn't be a government thing. It's an important topic, no doubt. But if that captures our attention to the exclusion of other things, then we're letting the government get away with a number of other measures that weaken the family. And then we are not heeding this call to promote measures designed to strengthen the family because we're distracted on the marriage topic. We feel like we lost. So then we just stop our efforts, not realizing that there are many other ways that the government impacts people's families. Let's use a crazy example to start. I got a few. Consider the war on drugs. So here's a brief story to encapsulate this. So it's January 4th, 2008, about 15 years ago. Police officers in Ohio were executing a SWAT raid to arrest Anthony Terry for allegedly dealing drugs. The cops opened fire after entering the home, killing Terry's unarmed girlfriend and mother of 6, Tarika Wilson, wounding her 14-month-old son, who was in her arms. The former SWAT commander for the police department stated on record when commenting on the incident that, quote, "It's not unusual for children to be inside homes raided by police officers. In far too many cases, innocent children, spouses, relatives, or visitors have been arrested, injured, or in many cases killed when cops were waging their war on drugs. One estimate suggests that these types of raids into homes across the country occur over 100 times per day in America." Look at the prisons and all these like nonviolent offenders in jails for drugs. There's 8 times as many women incarcerated in state and federal prisons as there was in 1980. Fathers are being torn away from families and kids, leading to welfare dependency and all the rest. That's not to say that we want a society full of people hooked on, whatever drug, but it's a public health issue and not a criminal justice one. And yet the state is destroying and undermining families in the name of preventing people from ingesting things that they don't like. So even a crazy example like the war on drugs illustrates how these are government measures that ultimately weaken the family. Consider moving away from the war on drugs to the war on poverty. Surely we want to help people. Surely we don't want people starving in the street, right? And so we have all these social welfare programs which break apart family cohesion. They suppress fertility rates. They encourage bearing children out of wedlock. They incentivize fatherlessness, and they promote multi-generational dependency upon the state rather than other members of the family unit. I wrote about some of this in Children of the Collective, and that has footnotes and all the rest if you're curious about looking any of that up. The point is that, you go to the national park and there's the sign that says, "Don't feed the bears," right? We don't want to encourage dependency from these creatures. Similarly, the state desires us to be dependent upon it. That's how it grows and thrives. And so we have this war on poverty and all these social programs that have the effect of weakening families. Here's a quote from one commentator I found. He said that the USA's welfare system is a disaster. It's creating poverty, not destroying it. It subsidizes divorce, unwed teenage pregnancy, the abandonment of elderly parents by their children, and the wholesale dissolution of the family. The reason? We pay people to be poor. So war on drugs, war on poverty. I mean, certainly we could talk about war itself, right? Prematurely sending soldiers to their unnecessary death, starving hundreds of thousands of people through sanctions, incarcerating people without due process, shooting at and bombing innocent people. It's one thing to promote measures to maintain the family, this theoretical conception of family, right? But one needs to also strengthen actual, physical, tangible, real families who are being destroyed by war and the military industrial complex machine that just chews up and spits out all these young pawns who are treated as cannon fodder. And that is literally destroying the family. Actual families, not just of the soldiers, but all the victims, all the so-called collateral damage, all the bystanders, civilians, just countless stories of families being disrupted and destroyed as a result of war. And so the commandment that we have, and I've done a musing all about that, to renounce war and proclaim peace is a measure designed to strengthen the family. We just don't think about it that way. We don't talk about that. Our leaders don't frame it in that context. But it is nevertheless true that if we want to basically promote or support the concepts in the Proclamation on the Family, if we're to be promoting measures designed to strengthen the family, we need to oppose war. We need to oppose the Federal Reserve. There's a fantastic book. Sorry, I got a little bit of sniffles this weekend. There's a fantastic book called The Bitcoin Standard the first half of which has nothing to do with Bitcoin. It's all about money. I believe that if you corrupt the money, you corrupt society, because money is a social lubricant. It's how we interact with one another. And if you corrupt the money, you're corrupting society, and corrupting families as part of that. So in this book, The Bitcoin Standard, he talks about the history of money, the differences between hard and soft money, and soft money being things that you can print dollar bills basically, or a digital currency that you just inflate with a keystroke on a keyboard, versus hard money such as gold, where it's very difficult to find new gold. It's very difficult to counterfeit. And so that's harder money. It's harder to counterfeit, basically. Okay, so here's a brief portion of that book that I thought fascinating, and I've thought about and written a lot about this since. The impact on the family of fiscal policy, of the money. So this is from Saifuddin Amos in the Bitcoin Standard. He says, when money was nationalized, it was placed under the command of politicians who operate over short time horizons of a few years, trying their best to get reelected. It was only natural that such a process would lead to short-term decision-making, where politicians abuse the currency to fund their re-election campaigns at the expense of future generations. As H.L. Mencken put it, every election is an advanced auction on stolen goods. In a society where money is free and sound, individuals have to make decisions with their capital that affects their families in the long run. While it is likely that some would make irresponsible decisions that hurt their offspring, those who wanted to make responsible decisions had the choice to do so. With nationalized money, that became an increasingly harder choice to make, as central governmental control of the money supply inevitably destroys incentives to save while increasing the incentive to borrow. No matter how prudent a person, his children will still witness their savings lose value and have to pay taxes to cover for the inflationary largesse of their government. If you're not following too well, I'll summarize this in just a second. He continues, as the reduction in intergenerational inheritance has reduced the strength of the family as a unit, government's unlimited checkbook has increased its ability to direct and shape the lives of people, allowing it an increasingly important role to play in more aspects of individuals' lives. The family's ability to finance the individual has been eclipsed by the state's largesse, resulting in declining incentives for maintaining a family. In a traditional society, individuals are aware that they will need children to support them in the future, and so will spend their healthy young years starting a family and investing in giving their children the best life possible. But if long-term investment in general is disincentivized, if saving is likely to be counterproductive as money depreciates, this investment becomes less profitable. Further, as politicians sell people the lie that eternal welfare and retirement benefits are possible through the magic of the monetary printing press, the investment in a family becomes even less impactful. Okay, so summary. The point he's making is that in the world that we operate in today with soft money, when the politicians can print money and debase the currency by printing a ton more of it, you and I become incentivized, as is the case with people in every economy throughout history where the money has inflated, let alone hyperinflated. We become incentivized to spend our money now while it has purchasing power, because we know, even if we don't understand economics or fiscal policy or whatever, we implicitly know that things are going to cost more in the future and our money is not going to have as much purchasing power down the road. So we become incentivized to have a shorter time horizon, and we narrowly focus on instant gratification and short-term pleasures to basically spend the money that we earn, and also to borrow money when it's cheap, right? So you look at all the bubbles and the housing bubbles and everything else. When people are incentivized to borrow money because it's cheap and easy to do so, they kick the can at the consequences. It's why the U.S. government has $34 trillion in debt at this point, right? It's always, wasn't that guy from Popeye who's like, I will gladly pay you tomorrow for a hamburger today. And that's how we become as individuals. We all as humans respond to incentives. And so we are incentivized with soft money to neglect our posterity because we know that the state will take care of them, Medicaid and Medicare and all the rest. And so we don't need to worry about it. People are not having nearly as many kids anymore. The fertility rate is massively plummeting because people no longer see an investment in their future as a long-term need and benefit. Because of the state's largesse, the cradle-to-grave care directly for the individual who's become disconnected from their family, and the debasement of the money that disincentivizes people from saving and investing over the long term. I mean, we could talk about high taxes, right? Like in Sweden, the example I shared, that leads both parents out in the workforce just to be able to maintain a decent standard of living because they've got, so much of their wealth being stolen by the government. And so it induces mom to leave the home and send the children to the care and custody of the state. We can talk about subsidies and bailouts that put many people out of business, raising prices on other people, creating more dependence upon the government. All these policies, war, drugs, property rights, zoning, abortion, tax policy, monetary policy, and all the rest impact families. And so if we are supposed to be promoting measures designed to strengthen the family as the fundamental unit of society, we are missing the mark if we myopically focus on marriage, as most Latter-day Saints have done. Missing the mark. And we are allowing, if not complicit in, the family's further degradation because so many members of the church are supporting the very policies that are weakening families. Okay. Now, the proclamation does not narrow its call for promoting these measures to government measures. Ultimately, the proclamation's ideals, I think, should be encouraged, not enforced. I think of Alma 31:5, where it says, it's talking about Alma, it says, "And now as the preaching of the word had a great tendency to lead the people to do that which was just, yea, it had more powerful effect upon the minds of the people than the sword or anything else which had happened unto them. Therefore, Alma thought it was expedient that they should try the virtue of the word of God." So in my mind, this means, marketing campaigns, social media projects, educational programs, events, other marketing initiatives to encourage these policies, to change hearts and minds. And I think we're going to lose the fight to defend the family if we continue to embrace this narrow interpretation of the proclamation, to the point where most people don't think or act on anything pertaining to it because they narrowed it to this marriage issue, which we lost in the courts, and therefore we can just disregard it or not pay it any attention. All the while, the state continues to grow and weaken the family. There's an inverse relationship between the state and families, community, society. In order for the state to grow, families have to be weak. That's why in every dystopian novel you see out there, the families are broken up. Children are born in birthing centers. Mothers have to surrender their children to nurturing centers. The state cares for the child, directly disconnecting the relationship between parent and child because the state needs to be the parent. You see this across dystopian literature. And it's there for a reason, because the state, to grow and thrive and be powerful, needs to supplant parents. They need to push them out. There's the quote from Hitler. I'll pull up here. I was sharing this in a speech that I did recently. Here's Hitler in 1933, obviously an extreme example, and yet a warning nonetheless. He says, "When an opponent declares, 'I will not come over to your side,' I calmly say, 'Your child belongs to us already. What are you? You will pass on. Your descendants, however, now stand in the new camp. In a short time, they will know nothing else but this new community.'" So I think that's what we're up against. The whole point of my recent book, Children of the Collective, spent 3 years working on this thing. The point is, collectivists historically have gone after the kids. They've tried to push parents to the side and create a direct relationship between the rising generation and the state. and create a feedback loop and a direct dependence so that families can be weakened and the state can grow. If families are strong, if communities are strong, if the society is strong, social fabric, then the state is weak because we're taking care of one another, right? We're taking care of our elderly. We're having kids. We have intergenerational families. We have community ties. It's why Alexis de Tocqueville, when he came to America, was blown away at what he called mediating institutions, because throughout Europe, there was a direct dependence upon the government. When someone had a problem, they'd go to the local government office to get it figured out. He was blown away that in America, when people had problems, they started up an association. They created a society, basically nonprofit, groups, to raise funds for and awareness of whatever perceived problem or ill there was in society. I mean, even before the war on poverty and the welfare state, you had mutual aid societies that were all over the place, where you'd chip in a little bit each month. It's kind of like the modern equivalent that there's hardly any more of is the healthcare sharing ministries, where it's not health insurance, but you can, chip in money and it's a contribution that is pooled together. And so if you get sick or whatever, then they'll help pay for your needs. That is a lingering example of what used to be all over the place in America until the state stepped in, started directly taxing people, started directly caring for them and providing welfare benefits. And then people were like, why am I going to chip in $10 a month to this mutual aid society for healthcare, orphan care, elderly care, when I'm already being taxed for that purpose? So I'm going to stop contributing. And almost overnight, these mutual aid societies lost their membership shut down because they couldn't compete with the state. So the whole book, Children of the Collective, is designed to illustrate across the board in so many ways how the family is being threatened by the state, and how if we want a limited government, we can't just vote better. We can't just, get that one guy elected or fight that one program or go to a rally and feel good that we got our I voted sticker, every 2 years. It's so much more, because the efforts of the state to come after our children are persistent and they are insidious and they often go under the radar of most people. And so as I read the Proclamation on the Family, do I think it's a prophecy? I think it's prophetic. I think it was revelatory. I don't think it's revealing necessarily any new doctrine, but to so succinctly describe and summarize and declare those doctrines in a compelling manner at the early days before any of this madness started happening, I think is prophetic. I consider it a prophetic document. And again, I think of, and I'll end here, with President Hinckley's purpose for announcing this, because of sophistry being passed off as truth, deception concerning standards and values, so much of allurement and enticement to take on the slow stain of the world. For those three reasons, he says, they felt to warn and forewarn. And so the 1995 proclamation was a warning, a forewarning of the future. And we're seeing the prophetic aspects of what was announced and, again, met with a collective shrug in 1995. Well, of course, there's two genders. Well, of course, this is how marriage is. Only a fringe at the edges of society, believe any different. But collectively, the majority, we all feel that, yeah, of course, that's how it is, until it isn't. So if you're interested in that book for a deeper dive, you can go to Amazon and check out Children of the Collective, or just search my name and it'll come up. If you're not aware yet, sundaymusings.org is where you can access past musings. You can filter down by topic. So if you want to go back and reference any of those past musings that I mentioned earlier, sundaymusings.org is the easiest place to be. I'll conclude with this. I think that the state is intervening in family affairs, in the family institution, from multiple angles and with a variety of weapons. And if all we think about is fighting same-sex marriage, even though we're not really doing that anymore, but if that's how we think that we need to respond to the Proclamation on the Family, it's like attempting to ward off this multifaceted attack with a single shield pointed in one direction. I think we as Latter-day Saints need to develop a much better strategy to counter the state's offensive, Caesar's offensive, ultimately Satan's offensive against our families. We're losing because we're distracted, and few among us are focused on core issues. It's like Henry David Thoreau, right? For every 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil, there's only one striking at the root. We need to strike the root of so many of society's problems. It's so tempting to hack at branches because you can see a lot of movement. Look, the leaves are rustling in the wind. Look, I can bend it to my will. I can move these branches. I cut this one off. It was easy. That's not sufficient. It's not going to be sufficient to change the course of the future. It's distracting. It's tempting. It's popular. I get it. But I think we need to be focused on the root. And the root of the war on poverty and actual war and the war on drugs and the Federal Reserve printing trillions of dollars and high taxes and everything else, the root is the impact on the family and the individual. And we need to have a much broader perspective, I think, about our pro-family policies as members of the church, so as not to limit ourselves to just being worried about marriage licensure and who's legally allowed to get married. I'm not going to say that's a distraction. It is on its face an important issue, but it is one of many. And I think we largely, as members of the church, are neglecting the others, if not complicit in making them worse. So many members of the church voting for morons who are, weakening the family with these policies, or members of the church in office who themselves are voting for and directly complicit in these problems. We got a lot of work to do. Part of the challenge is we don't really talk this way. We don't really frame the proclamation from this broader policy perspective. Too controversial or whatever, right? And so members of the church are asleep at the wheel, and they think that they could just vote however they want. And, I wear my church hat on Sunday, and then I can go do and think and act in ways that I want Monday through Saturday. And I can be a member of whatever political party and vote for whatever policy that I think best, because it has no bearing on anything else other than that issue alone and my opinions of it. Poppycock. Rubbish. I don't agree with that at all. But we don't really talk any differently about it. And I think that has cultivated a culture of, I'll call it, I don't know, apathy, I guess, where members of the church are not really trying to interpret and apply our faith and its doctrines to policies outside of the obvious, such as same-sex or opposite-sex marriage. So I think we got a lot of work to do. This is something I reflect on a lot. I see so much of the state's oppression as more than just that particular policy. It has broad systemic impacts. It undermines the family. And if we want to promote measures designed to strengthen the families, the fundamental unit of society, we got to broaden our view. With that, I take my leave, heading home from the cabin. Got a big week ahead of me. I'll see you guys next Sunday.